Hi AP World History students. This is a flip lesson for 5.7 Part 2. Part 1 is about a crisis in the Russian Empire. This Part 2 here is a crisis in the Ottoman Empire. And there are a lot of parallels. In fact, there's many parallels not only between the Ottomans and the Russians, but also, I suppose, with the Chinese and the Japanese. These are once mighty political states and cultural zones that were seeing themselves surpassed by the West, by Western Europe, and even the United States, and struggling to reconcile what that means for them and what the appropriate response would be. So let's look at how this played out in the Middle East with the Ottomans. Like was the case in Russia and China and Japan, there's a tension that's created by the feeling of watching your society be surpassed. And that tension is between reformers and modernizers and people who would sort of say, I guess if you can't beat them, join them. Let's join with what the West is doing. And traditionalists or reactionaries or conservatives, whatever word you'd want to use here, but people who would say, no, we have to return to what made us great in the past. And so the answer is in the past rather than in the West, or in looking for something new necessarily. Though, again, if you were in Istanbul in 1800 or in 1850, this is still a cosmopolitan, enormous city of beautiful art and architecture. However, like we've talked about, the stagnancy that had begun to set in, the intellectual kind of stasis, the political corruption, some of the military setbacks, that stagnancy was making it difficult for the Ottomans when they attempt to reform. Some of their attempts to reform are absolutely on the right track, but there's so much to overcome because the stagnancy had really set in at this point. So if you're looking, again, period 5, 1750 to 1900, when we talk about the trouble that the Ottoman Empire was in, one place to look at as a sign of trouble is the fact that it was shrinking. Their territory was being chipped away, like you can see on the map here. So on the Arabian Peninsula, they lost territory to the Saud family. This is the modern dynasty of Saudi Arabia. This is a fundamentalist Islamic, sort of Wahhabi Islam touting family or dynasty that is creating a new state. So the Ottomans lose out on the original homeland of Islam itself. The Ottomans lose that, and no longer can, like the Ottoman sultans, go to make a Hajj and stay completely within Ottoman territory. Now they're going to foreign territory. That's embarrassing. In North Africa, Egypt becomes independence, fights for independence, and creates its own state. Europe is chipping away. France takes Algeria. In the Balkans, Southeast Europe, and Greece, nationalism is brewing, like we've talked about, and they're breaking away. In Southeast Europe, it's particularly ugly, in large part because there's a sizable Christian presence there, or like a Christian minority there, and some of the crackdowns or the retaliation that the Ottomans were trying to use against these nationalists in Southeast Europe and in the Balkans, it gets really ugly and terrible. And Europe is intervening a little bit. Russia tries to intervene because they say, these are Christian or Orthodox or Slavic brothers. There's some ethnic connection there. And so the Russians get involved. So the Ottoman Empire is shrinking now. Interestingly, the rest of Europe doesn't want the Ottoman Empire to collapse. In part because the rest of Europe recognizes, going back to this Treaty of Westphalia, that this balance of power is a good thing. They don't want things to go too haywire. And so keeping that sort of stable balance of power between European states was something that was viewed by diplomats as good and worthy. The other problem is, if you look at the territories that the Ottoman Empire occupied, still some chunks of Southeast Europe, large parts of the Middle East, the rest of Europe recognized, if you just let the lid off that pot and let these places, if the Ottoman Empire collapses, we don't know what that will bring if these places become autonomous all of a sudden. And if the religious and ethnic tensions within those areas are unleashed, that might be bad for everybody. So the Ottomans are, old cultural and political rivals, but they're also predictable. And having them there, we know what that's about. They're not a legitimate threat to the rest of Europe. And so the rest of Europe, the Eastern question is sort of this issue of what do we do when the Ottoman Empire goes away? We believe that it will be going away. We kind of want to help it down into infirmity. We don't want it to collapse too quickly. As a matter of fact, there's an agreement that if it looks like it is going to collapse quickly, they want to prevent that from happening because the Ottoman Empire is seen as kind of preventing worse problems from popping up. However, while the Ottomans may have appreciated that somewhat paternalistic approach taken by the rest of Europe, they did not appreciate the fact that the rest of Europe was able to dictate pretty humiliating terms to the Ottoman Empire, like these capitulations, as they were referred to, or it's sometimes called extraterritoriality, where it meant that Europeans living in the Ottoman Empire, particularly merchants and bankers, because the Ottoman Empire did not have its own class of merchants and bankers by this point to be doing much of that business, they didn't need to live. They were not subject to Ottoman law. They were subject to the laws of their home countries. And the Ottomans, this is embarrassing for them to have to accept that, but they need they needed business activity and they needed banking activity, and so they had to accept that the foreign merchants and bankers living in their country were not subject to their own laws. So the response to this, the response to the losing of territory and seeing themselves being surpassed by the West and some of these embarrassments, the response is attempts at reform that are not altogether successful in the end. So Sultan Mahmud II starts, a crazy start is by declaring war on his own Janissary Corps and having them massacred. The Janissaries, once upon a time, were the symbol. They were innovative, militarily innovative. Remember, these are the young boys enslaved from Christian communities and kind of raised as Muslim warriors or sometimes as bureaucrats and as eunuchs, and they were the elite warrior caste in the Ottoman Empire. By this point, the Janissary had resisted any attempts to modernize modernize the Ottoman army with with artillery and rifles and things like this. They had resisted that, and they had even killed one of the sultans not that much earlier than this, in 1802 or 1807. And so Sultan Mahmud II just does away with them. He has the entire corps of them, or a class of them, massacred, and that's the end. Because they had been one of those forces of tradition, or one of those reactionary forces that had stood in the way, along with, of course, the Muslim clerics and religious bureaucrats that were urging the sultans to look to the past for the solution to this problem. Eliminating the Janissaries is one of the starts of the Tanzimat era. This is like an era of attempted reform or reorganization. It's the Ottoman state trying to get with the times. With the biggest symbols of this are schools, not quite secular schools, but they're not the mosque schools that the Ottomans had always had. Secular law, that's a major change away from Sharia law. Claiming political rights for men, not women, but for men. That's a new step and a very Western and almost Enlightenment step. Moves toward industrialization, moves toward the embrace of Western science. These are big changes, all right? The wind is blowing in a different direction. So during this period, the middle chunk of the 19th century in this Tanzimat era, there's somewhat halting and not, again, altogether successful, but the moves are toward modernization. However, all those moves, it's all a little bit haphazard, and there's a sort of bracketed pressure. People on either side, again, the reactionaries, once upon a time the Janissaries, but now it's the Muslim clerics and the radical reformers, the people who want to push this along much more rapidly. And this catching up process was not smooth or simple or easy. The most dramatic stage in this is a particular group that's called the Young Ottomans. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the Young Turks. Now, the Young Turks is a specific group of modernist reformers, actually, that comes later on at the start of the 20th century. But sometimes the Young Ottomans and the Young Turks, it sounds pretty similar. They are pretty similar in their aims, and so sometimes you'll hear the same term used to refer to both. Anyway, so that's just so that you know what we're talking about. The Young Ottomans or the Young Turks are interested in modernization, constitutional government rather than absolutist monarchy, which is what the Sultan had always been. They're intellectuals. They are children of the Enlightenment, but they're not of the Enlightenment in the sense that they were Muslim, and they wanted Islam to have a presence in the modern world and not simply in the 7th century world. And so they were reconciling Islam with these modernizing impulses. In the 1870s, under another Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, they establish and create a constitutional government with the Sultan and a representative government. And this is the first constitutional government in Ottoman history, and this is a grandiose moment. And unfortunately, it lasts only about a year, just over a year, before the new Sultan says, well, enough of that, and under the influence or advice of the old religious clerics, announces a return to absolute monarchy. And so it's this kind of zigzagging approach that is ultimately not successful, and the Young Turks are now in disfavor, and some of them are jailed, many of them are sent into exile. They go off to Paris, the home to revolutionaries at all different times in history, and they are in exile. But they're continuing to use publications and mass media newspapers to publish things and try to sort of stir or try to fuel modernization efforts back in the Ottoman Empire, but they're doing this from afar. The return to absolute monarchy was not the key to Ottoman success, as it turns out, and there was another wave of Young Turks, as I mentioned, in 1908. These Young Turks were able to take power, and a new Ottoman state is created. But at that point, it really is effectively too late. The Ottoman Empire was effectively in its death throes. World War I, at that point, is some 6 years away, and when the Ottomans jump in on the losing side of that ends up being the end. And we'll see in the next period what happens to the Ottoman Empire when it does cease to exist. It's not happy. So a challenge for you as we finish here is to just sort of make that mental run through. If I had this LEQ in front of me and I'm doing quick similarities and differences, if we compare and contrast 19th century reform efforts in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, what do we see? We don't hear, by the way, that Russia and the Ottoman Empire did go to war. They were fighting over the area of Crimea, which is like in the Black Sea region, sort of between the two nations. The Russians were also getting involved in some of the Ottomans' troubles in the Balkans. But that's enough of that. There you have 5.7, Part 2, How are the Ottomans responding to these changes? Thank you guys for watching. Good job doing your homework, and I'll see you in class.